Do you mind if I begin with a terribly dark story? I did test it on my 10-year-old daughter earlier this morning, and she confirmed that it was a terribly dark story, so I'm looking out at the kids going, you're gonna have a fun ride home. Okay, anyways, in 1953, the Southern Catholic writer Flannery O'Connor wrote a short story titled, "A Good Man is Hard to Find." And in this story, we're introduced to a family of 6. The matriarch and main character, grandmother, her son, his wife, and their 3 kids. And they head out on a road trip from their hometown, Atlanta, Georgia, to Florida. The grandmother had tried to persuade the family to go to Tennessee instead. She pointed to a newspaper article about a criminal who recently escaped prison and was making his way to Florida as well, a criminal who called himself the Misfit. Her attempt to change their vacation plans was unsuccessful, but she did manage to get one thing her way. Against her son's wishes, she snuck her cat into the car, hiding him in a basket underneath her small suitcase at her feet. On their travels, we get to know the grandmother more and more. She's a religious woman, also quite opinionated, often condescending, and terribly self-absorbed. As they're traveling down the road, the grandmother is reminded of an old plantation house nearby, and she begs her son to turn down this little dirt road so she could see it one more time. Much to the annoyance of her son, they turned down the bumpy dirt road and had gone some distance when all of a sudden it dawned on the grandmother that she had gotten things mixed up. The plantation house was in an entirely different state, and when this realization struck her, it caused her face to turn red and her feet to suddenly jump. And as her feet jumped, it knocked the suitcase off the basket. And the stowaway cat jumped out and sprung on her son's shoulder. And so startled was he that the next thing you know, the car flipped over and landed right side up in a deep ditch on the side of the road. Well, a few minutes later, as they were trying to figure out what to do and how to get help, a car approached slowly from the distance. Grandmother waved her arms frantically to make sure they saw, and sure enough, the car slowed down and stopped, and out came 3 men, 1 older, 2 younger, all with guns. The older man looked familiar to the grandmother somehow, but she couldn't quite place him. Meanwhile, the son began explaining what had happened and how they got into this mess, when all of a sudden, the grandmother shrieked, realizing who he was, and said, "You're the Misfit." To which the man replied, "Yes, ma'am, but it would have been much better for all of you, lady, if you hadn't recognized me." And one by one, the 2 younger men took the family members off into the woods and shot them dead, until finally, it was just the grandmother and the Misfit, and she's pleading for mercy. She tries to get him to pray to Jesus for help. She says Jesus can help him. He's a good boy. She knows that, but he doesn't want help, he says. She keeps saying, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus can help you. Finally, he replies, Jesus thrown everything off balance. She continues, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus can help you. And he says, Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, and he shouldn't have done it. He thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can, by killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. Maybe he didn't raise the dead, the grandmother mumbled in reply. I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't. I wish I had have been there. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I had been there, I would have known. I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. That moment she looked at him, saw his face was twisted like he was about to cry, and suddenly she saw in the Misfit a child like one of her own. Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children, she said. And she reached out, she touched him on the shoulder, and the Misfit sprang back and shot her dead. An English professor, that's the end of the story. An English professor some years later wrote Flannery O'Connor expressing that his students couldn't agree on the meaning of this story. So he was asking for her help. And she wrote back, and she didn't often like to summarize the meanings of her stories, but she did this time. She summarized it in a single sentence, and she said this: the story is a duel of sorts, a duel between the grandmother and her superficial beliefs, Jesus, 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 and the misfits' more profoundly felt involvement with Christ's action, which set the world off balance for him. Let me say it again. The story is a duel of sorts between the grandmother and her superficial beliefs and the misfits' more profoundly felt involvement with Christ's action, which set the world off balance for him. He didn't believe in Jesus like she did, but he did recognize that if Jesus was real, if resurrection was real, then everything changes. Then there's nothing for you to do but to throw away everything and follow him. It was the misfit, the unbeliever, that had a more profound involvement with Christ than the grandmother. It was Christ and his resurrection, after all, that had thrown everything off balance for him. We're in a series in the book of Acts right now, and Acts tells the story of the Christian revolution and how what was sparked by Jesus of Nazareth, his life and death and resurrection, became a full-blown forest fire, how it was fueled, how it spread throughout the ancient world, and how it continues to spread in our own day and age. And this morning, we're going to look at a story about Paul, who is sharing the gospel in ancient Athens. And everything is going fine and well in his speech until he gets to the part about Jesus and resurrection. The part about Jesus and his resurrection provokes a sharp response from the crowd. And the reason it provokes such a strong reaction, I think, is that the gathered crowd understood what the misfit understood. That if Jesus is real and resurrection is true, then everything is thrown off balance. Open up, if you will, to Acts 17. Acts 17, page 901. And the Bible's underneath the seats in front of you. So we are in the middle of Paul's second gospel-proclaiming, church-planting adventure across the Mediterranean world. In his first journey, he only made it as far as the middle of modern-day Turkey. He made it to a city called Derbe, and then he retraced his steps back to Antioch, which was his home base. That was his first journey. In the second journey, he goes deeper into the Roman world, visiting a number of places from his first journey, like Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch of Pisidia. But then he continues further westward, eventually landing in Philippi, modern-day northeastern Greece. And that's where we were last week. Toshi led us through the conversion stories of 3 different people in Philippi. So today we're going to finish up Paul's second journey as he continues making his way through modern-day Greece. Now, there are 4 main places he travels in this second half of his second journey, but the problem is that if we spend time looking at everything, we won't have enough time for any of the places. So allow me to summarize, if you will. In chapter 17, verses 1 through 9, Paul goes to Thessalonica, and stuff happens. Then in verses 10 through 14, he travels to Berea, more stuff happens. How's that for a summary? Let's pick it up now in verse 15. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving instruction to have Silas and Timothy join him as soon as possible, they left him. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he argued in the synagogue with the Jews and devout persons, and also in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be there. So Paul ends up in Athens, and he's with the Jews and God-fearers, that's Gentiles who worship in the synagogue, but he's also in the marketplace, in what is called in the Greek the agora, the city center or town square. I have a picture of it for you, the agora in Athens. It's mostly just ruins now. I actually think that large building off on the right side is original for the most part, minus the roof. Anyways, Paul is spending time in both the synagogue and also the agora here. And what is he doing? He is arguing. The Greek word used here is actually dialogeto, which sounds like dialogue, right? And that's what it means. Paul is dialoguing, not so much arguing, but dialoguing with Jews in the synagogues and Greeks in the marketplace. Perhaps we're even to imagine the kind of dialogue made popular by Socrates, Socratic dialogue, which would be appropriate because this is Athens, after all, where Socrates walked 450 years prior. Let's continue in verse 18. Also, some Epicurean and Stoic philosophers debated with him. Some said, "What does this babbler want to say?" Others said, "He seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities." This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. So Jesus is dialoguing and debating Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. And you might forget this. It's okay. This is for those of you who like ancient philosophy, which I'm going to assume is the vast majority of you. Is that a fair assumption? The two dominant philosophical schools at this time in Athens were Epicureanism and Stoicism. Epicureans were your materialists. If the gods exist, they live far away. They're uninterested and uninvolved in human life and activity, building temples, making sacrifices like their pagan friends. It's silly. The gods don't live in temples. As far as us, we are just atoms randomly colliding with one another. There is no afterlife. The gods are distant, so stop being scared of either the gods or death and work to maximize pleasure. Stoicism was quite different. Stoics rejected the idea that we're all just atoms randomly colliding, and they believed that the relationship between God and the world is like or parallel to the relationship between the soul and the body. Just as my soul sort of inhabits my body, so God inhabits the world. The way they spoke of this actually is to say that underneath everything, underneath this physical world, is a divine rational substructure or order. They actually called it the Logos. God is the Logos that permeates the world. So Paul is engaging these philosophers, and notice how they respond. Some say he's a babbler. The word that's used here literally refers to a bird that picks up and spits out seed. It's an insult. It's basically saying that Paul is unoriginal. He just picks up bits of knowledge and spits them out without any real understanding. He's going to shortly prove them wrong. The second response is not mockery, but potentially more serious. It says, he seems to be a proclaimer of foreign divinities. This was because he was telling the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Now, notice that divinities is in the plural. So how does that work if he's talking about Jesus? This is going to sound weird. I think it's kind of funny, but the word for resurrection is the Greek word anastasis, which is also a woman's name in Greek. So most commentators actually think that people misheard Paul when he spoke about Jesus and resurrection, and they thought he was introducing not one, but two foreign divinities, namely Jesus and Anastasis, or in English, Anastasia. Well, even with this potentially weird misunderstanding, the charge of proclaiming foreign divinities was kind of serious. 450 years prior, Socrates was tried and executed in the city of Athens. And do you know what one of the charges was? Proclaiming foreign divinities, actually. Now, it's not an automatic death sentence for Paul. You can actually proclaim a foreign deity in Athens. You can even buy land, you can construct a temple, begin sacrificing to it. That's well within the rules, so long as it's given the stamp of approval by a certain group of people. And that's who Paul is brought to next. Look at verse 19. So they took him and brought him to the Areopagus and asked him, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are presenting? It sounds rather strange to us, so we would like to know what it means." Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. So Paul is brought before this council of Athens' political and intellectual elite. They are the gatekeepers for any new divinities or new teachings, and they are referred to as the Areopagus. They're actually named after this hill, which was their original meeting spot. That's also known as Mars Hill. Maybe you've heard of it. You can't see it, but the Agora would have been, or Marketplace would have been down and to the right from there. Anyways, Paul is brought, probably not to this hill, because in the first century they were meeting in the Agora, not on Mars Hill anymore. But he was brought to the council and he gets up to explain his teaching. Look at verse 22. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. Let's pause for a moment. Paul notes they are extremely religious. I see that you are extremely devoted is the idea. It's a compliment. And he goes on to point out something he came across as he went through the city, an altar to an unknown God. Now, this is quite mysterious. Why would there be an altar to an unknown God? Maybe it was someone who was scared. Maybe it was someone who was scared that in all their worship, all their devotion to the gods of sea, sky, harvest, love, beauty, sex, etc., commerce, maybe someone was scared that there was a God that was missed. And if a God was missed, that God might get angry, so an altar is built and sacrifices made just in case. Or maybe it wasn't fear, but rather humility. An acknowledgement that as complex of a system as Greco-Roman paganism was, at least someone acknowledged a gap, a void, acknowledged that there might be some God completely beyond their comprehension. One commentator talked about how there's two kinds of agnosticism. Agnosticism is different from atheism because agnosticism, unlike atheism, doesn't say that God doesn't exist. It just says we can't know or we don't know whether God exists. And he points out that there's an open version of agnosticism and a closed version. The closed version says, I don't know that God exists. I can't know that God exists. And third, I prefer it so. I prefer it that way because then I can get on and do whatever I want. I don't know, I can't know, and I prefer it so. But there's another version of agnosticism that's genuinely open. I don't know. I don't know if I can know, but I'd prefer to know. There's an openness to actually having that void filled in. And Paul seems to interpret the altar in that second way, because look at how he continues. What therefore you worship is unknown. This I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. Paul is saying, regarding this altar to the unknown, there is, in fact, a God beyond your comprehension. A God completely beyond your comprehension. He made everything. He is beyond everything. He is self-sufficient, he says, self-sustaining. He is the ground of all being, the source of life and breath and all things. Verse 26, from one ancestor, he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live. It's kind of a tricky sentence, but let me try to say this as simply as I can. Just prior to this, Paul has just said that God is the creator of the universe, the ground of existence. Here, he's saying that God is also the Lord of history. Nations or peoples, the Greek word is ethnos, along with their bounded regions and bounded eras, it's under his control. Back in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 32:8, it says this: when the Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the gods. The Lord's own portion was his people, Jacob his allotted share. This is a fascinating text that I wish we had more time to spend on, but what he's saying, and Paul actually seems to be alluding to it, if not quoting from it, is that, you know, polytheism, every nation or people with its own God, it's God's idea. Or maybe that's not quite right, but he did arrange it, or he certainly allowed it, and then he took Jacob or Israel as his own. I don't know if that bothers you or brings up new questions. Let's just move on and pretend it didn't happen. Verse 20. But look at the first part of verse 26 again. From one ancestor, or from one, literally, he made all peoples to inhabit the whole earth, And then that attaches to the beginning of verse 27. This is why God made us, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. God made us for himself, he's saying, to be in relationship with him, and he's close. Verse 28. For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. Paul here is quoting the Greek poet Aratus, who is actually in context talking about Zeus. For we too are Zeus's offspring. You'll notice Paul, of course, leaves that out. But his argument here is that we come from God. God doesn't come from us. That's why idols and images don't make sense. The Greco-Roman gods are little more than projections of humanity, of humanity's imagination. Gods who are strong like humans, but even more so. Gods who are cranky like humans, but even more so. Gods who are envious like humans, but even more so. Projections of humanity. Paul quotes one of their own poets to say, no, God doesn't come from us. We come from him. So your idolatry makes no sense. Verse 30. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now he commands all people everywhere to repent. Remember that Deuteronomy passage that Paul alludes to? Every nation or people group with its own God. Yes, God allowed it. Perhaps you could say to some degree he arranged it, but that was a time of human ignorance. And God overlooked it. He allowed it, but not anymore. Now he commands you to repent. Verse 31, because he has fixed a day on which he will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. When they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, we will hear you again about this. At that point, Paul left them, but some of them joined him and became believers, including Dionysius the Areopagite. That's one of the members of the council. And a woman named Damaris and others with them. So the setting for this speech is not a legal trial, but Paul is submitting his teaching to the Areopagus for judgment. And you'll notice in verse 31 how Paul then turns the tables towards the end of his speech. He says that a day has been fixed when the tables will be turned. It won't be you judging the news of Jesus, it will be the news of Jesus judging you. And when he begins to speak about resurrection, some start to laugh or scoff. Others say, we will hear you again about this. That probably sounds too positive. Enough, some other time is what I think that means. After this, Paul heads over west to Corinth, where more stuff happens for a year and a half, actually. And then he goes to Ephesus, to Caesarea, to Jerusalem, and back to Antioch, end of journey. I want us to think about Paul's engagement with Athens. Paul's engagement with Athens. First, I want you to notice that Paul looked and listened. Paul looked and listened. If you were to enter Athens in the first century, as Paul did from the north, you would first encounter the temple of Demeter, the goddess of harvest. Next would have been the statue of Poseidon, the god of sea and storms. Then a gym devoted to Hermes, god of trade and business. Then a house used for the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine and pleasure. In that house would have been images of Zeus and Apollo, the gods of sky and healing and prophecy, respectively. Next would have been the shrine of Ares, the god of war. Then the temple of Hephaestus, the god of fire. Then the sanctuary of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. And then, once you were in the agora, the marketplace, there were all sorts of temples and statues of gods and past emperors and heroes and military commanders. In the agora, there were these pillars called the Hermae, stone pillars with the head of Hermes and something else carved on the pillars lower down that I can't even mention without losing my job. And then if you looked up from the agora, you'd see on a hill the very famous Acropolis, the 45-foot statue of Athena, the patron goddess of the city, and her temple, perhaps you've heard of it, the Parthenon. Here's what it looks like 2,000 years later. This picture is actually taken from the agora where Paul was. Try to ignore the cranes. What's fascinating to me about this is that Paul takes the time to look. Verse 23 again, I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship. Not only did Paul look carefully as he toured the city, but he obviously listened as well. His entire speech is an engagement with pagan religion, with Stoicism, and with Epicureanism. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. Paul looked and listened. You know, many of us, I know, want to share the gospel of Jesus with people. We've experienced the goodness of Jesus, and so we want to share that with others, but we don't know how to start, right? And we so awkwardly try to steer the conversation in a religious direction. Or I think some of us, at least this is me, we treat gospel conversations like that jump rope game on the playground. You know when you're a kid, like two people are holding a jump rope and they're swinging it around, and when it's your turn, you sort of wait for it, you got to time it just right. I was terrible at that. I'd jump in, and then it'd hit me in the head or tangle up in my feet. I looked like a fool. And I think that some of us treat gospel conversations with people like that game. We think that if we wait for the perfect opportunity, boom, jump in there, then we won't look like a fool. The rope won't hit our heads or tangle in our feet. But do we look and listen? Do we really look and listen? Do we really understand the religiosity and even philosophy or philosophy of life of the people we want to introduce to Jesus? Do we really know what makes them tick? Do we really know where there might be gaps in their knowledge, altars to the unknown? If we take the time to look and listen, I think we'll know where to start, how to start, when to start. Paul looked and listened. Second, notice that Paul was grieved over their idolatry. Verse 16 again, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So as Paul tours first century Athens, he sees something beyond what your normal tourist would have seen. Whereas your normal tourist in the first century of Athens would see the artistic skill and imagination in the statues and shrines and temples, which Paul notices too, according to verse 29. Paul sees something else. Paul looks at the Parthenon and the bronze statue of Athena, the shrine to Ares, the sanctuary of Aphrodite, the statues of military commanders and emperors and past heroes, and he sees a decaying museum of misplaced trust. He sees humanity made for God, but groping about in the dark, creating gods and goddesses that cannot save, giving their trust and time and labor and money to heroes and gods and goddesses that cannot fulfill the deepest longings of their hearts. You know, I like to condescend towards idolatry. I don't know about you, and idol worshipers. I get a certain pleasure thinking about the vain ways that people try to gain fame through social media, for instance. The silliness with which people strive for money and more power. I feel disdain towards idol worship, sense of moral superiority and rightness. Do I feel grieved? Am I deeply distressed? Does my heart break as I peer beneath the surface? Notice that Paul was grieved over idolatry. Third, notice that Paul affirmed and challenged. So do you remember how I took that time to explain Stoicism and Epicureanism to you? I did that for a reason. You see, when we know more about those ancient philosophies, we're able to see what's going on in Paul's speech. Throughout his speech, he's engaging them, plus paganism, the worship of Greco-Roman gods. And listen, he has something positive to say about all three. Or at least he says something that would have been agreeable to all three. Regarding the pagans, remember in the very beginning, he commends their devotion. They are extremely religious. He commends their humility, their altar to an unknown God, their acknowledgement that there are gods and truths beyond their comprehension. Regarding Epicureans, he agrees with them that God cannot possibly live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands. The Epicureans would have said amen. Regarding the Stoics, he agrees that God gives to mortals all life and breath and all things. Indeed, God is not far from us, he says, for in him we live and move and have our being. The Stoics would have said, amen. Paul can easily affirm some of the truths held by his audience. He can even quote positively their poets, but at the same time, he's not afraid to tell them that they're wrong. He's not afraid to tell them what they're missing. What about us? Can we only challenge but not affirm? Can we only affirm but not challenge? Paul does both. Fourth, Paul preached a greater God. Here's the message that Paul preaches, if I can sum it up as succinctly as I can. God is so much greater than you've been imagining. It's his message. God is so much greater than you have long imagined. He is creator, ground of all existence. He's the Lord of history. He is transcendent and totally distinct from his creation against the Stoics, and yet he's close, he's immanent against the Epicureans. He's involved, and he's going to judge the world in righteousness, he says in verse 31. You know, we look at that as a negative, but to judge in the Bible is to bring justice. When God judges the world in righteousness, that means everything is going to change. God is going to turn this world right side up. He's going to make everything sad come untrue. To quote Sam Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. Everything sad come untrue. God is so much greater than you've been imagining, and the future is so much brighter than you've been hoping. And the reason we know this, Paul says, is because of Jesus and Anastasis. Not his girlfriend, but his resurrection. And if you remember, it was at this point that the crowd checked out, right? His speech was over at this point. They mocked him. They said, enough, some other time. Why? Why was everything fine until the resurrection part? Well, the founder of the Areopagus in the 5th century BC wrote this. When a man dies and his blood is spilled on the ground, there is no resurrection. All right then, thank you very much. That was the founder of the Areopagus. So maybe that's why. If there was one thing everyone in the Areopagus could agree on, although they couldn't agree on much, it was that this, when you're dead, right? So maybe that's why they mocked Paul. But I think there might be another reason. And I think it might be related to the story by Flannery O'Connor. Verse 21 again. Now, all the Athenians and the foreigners living there would spend their time in nothing but telling or hearing something new. This describes the philosophical and intellectual climate of the day, probably our day too, right? We love spending time telling and hearing things that are new. But notice how different the claim about resurrection is. You know, when Paul is talking theology, engaging the philosophies and religions of the day, it's interesting, right? To anybody. It's something to chew on, to think about, to ponder. And intellectuals love to chew on and think about and ponder. But the resurrection part is sort of a conversation stopper. Because that's not theology. That's history, right? It either happened or it didn't. I mean, we all like, along with the Athenians, ideas that can be sampled and discussed, controlled and edited. It's fun, it's interesting. But if Jesus did what Paul said he did, then this is not something that can be treated like any other interesting idea. If he did what Paul said, well, then it's nothing for you but to throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you but to enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can. Where are you at this morning? The challenging question. How thick or how thin is your spirituality? How superficial or how profound is your involvement with Christ and his resurrection?